I was fresh out of college and struggling to make ends meet, so I picked up a late-night shift at a local 24-hour diner. It wasn't glamorous, but the tips were decent, and the overnight hours fit my schedule. The diner had a mix of regulars, night shift workers, and the occasional oddball. One Thursday night, around 1:30 a.m., a man came in. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a battered leather jacket and a weathered cap. His gaze lingered a little too long as I handed him a menu. "What's good here?" he asked, his voice gruff but friendly enough. I recommended the usual burgers, pancakes, and coffee. He smiled and said, "I'll take whatever you think is best." I laughed politely and went to put in his order. When I brought out his burger and fries, he struck up a conversation, asking about my shift and if it ever got boring. I gave polite, vague answers. He introduced himself as Mark and commented, "You've got a nice smile." I ignored the comment, quickly refilled his coffee, and went to wipe down the counter. Mark stayed for nearly an hour, eating slowly, watching me whenever he thought I wasn't looking. Eventually, he paid his bill and left, leaving a decent tip. I thought that was the end of it, but Mark came back the next night, this time just before my shift ended. The diner was quiet, with only one other customer seated near the window. Mark sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and started asking personal questions. Where I lived, if I had a boyfriend, what my plans were after work. I dodged his questions as best I could, keeping my answers short. When he left, I noticed he had scribbled something on the receipt. "Call me," with his number beneath it. I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash. Over the next week, Mark became a regular. He always sat in my section, even when the diner had plenty of empty booths. His comments became more intrusive. Compliments on my hair, my laugh, even the way I walked. One night, he leaned across the counter and said, "You'd look great in red. You should wear it more often." That's when the unease really set in. I started to dread seeing him walk through the door. One night, as I was locking up, I noticed a car idling across the street. I couldn't see the driver, but it felt like someone was watching me. I brushed it off as paranoia and hurried to my car. The following evening, after my shift ended, I drove home as usual. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw something on my porch, a single red rose with a note that read, "Thought this would suit you." My heart raced. How did he know where I lived? I locked the doors and called the police. They took my report but said there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence. A couple of nights later, after another long shift, I got home and noticed my mailbox had been tampered with. Inside was another note, "You're even prettier when you're scared." That was it. I packed a bag and stayed with a friend for the next week. I told my manager I couldn't work nights anymore and eventually quit the job. I never saw Mark again, but for months, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow, every unfamiliar car parked on the street, sent shivers down my spine. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were, but I'm grateful I trusted my instincts and got out of that situation when I did. I was 24 and exhausted after a brutal semester. To recharge, I booked a trip to a quiet coastal town. It was small, historic, and perfect for a solo getaway. I found a cozy Airbnb in the heart of the historic district, a room on the second floor with a little balcony overlooking narrow cobblestone streets. The first day was perfect. I wandered along the waterfront, took photos of weathered old buildings, and enjoyed a seafood dinner at a quaint restaurant. By the second evening, I was fully in vacation mode and decided to check out a pub I'd seen online. It promised live music and a laid-back vibe. The place was just as described. A local band was playing acoustic covers, and the crowd was small. Just enough people to make it lively but not overwhelming. I grabbed a drink and settled at the bar. That's when a man sat next to me. He introduced himself as Jack. He looked about 30, with short dark hair and an unshaven, rugged appearance. At first, he was friendly, asking the usual small talk questions: where I was from, what brought me to town. I mentioned I was staying in an Airbnb nearby and enjoying the quiet. His eyes lit up at that. "Traveling alone?" he asked. "Yeah, just needed a break from everything," I said lightly, but something about his question made me uneasy. He nodded, sipping his drink. "Does anyone know you're here? Friends? Family?" The question caught me off guard. I laughed awkwardly. "Yeah, I've been texting my parents. They always check in on me when I travel." His expression didn't change, but he finished his drink and stood up. "Well, have a good night," he said, smiling in a way that didn't feel entirely genuine. I stayed at the pub a little longer, trying to convince myself that the conversation was harmless. Maybe he was just socially awkward. But as I walked back to my Airbnb, unease settled over me. The streets were empty, and the sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain someone was following me. But every time I looked back, there was nothing. Just the faint glow of old-fashioned streetlights and the distant sound of waves crashing. When I reached the Airbnb, I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and tried to shake off my nerves. I told myself I was overreacting. But then, as I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone, I heard it, a soft creak. It sounded like a footstep on the stairs. I froze. The owner had assured me I'd have the house to myself. My mind raced. Was it just the old house settling? Or was someone there? Then I heard another creak, closer this time. I turned off the light and sat in silence, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside my door. There was a knock. It was soft, hesitant, like whoever it was didn't want to wake the neighbors. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed a lamp from the bedside table, my heart pounding. Then the knocking stopped, and silence filled the air. For a moment, I thought it was over. Maybe whoever it was had left. But then I heard the sliding door to the balcony. I turned toward the sound just in time to see Jack climbing in through the open door. "You really shouldn't have told me you were alone," he said, his voice low and menacing. Panic surged through me. I threw the lamp at him, narrowly missing, and bolted for the door. Fumbling with the lock, I finally managed to yank it open and sprinted down the stairs. I didn't stop running until I reached a neighboring house. Banging on the door, I screamed for help. A groggy older man eventually opened it, letting me in and calling 911. When the police arrived, they searched the Airbnb, but Jack was gone. They found no signs of forced entry, and the sliding door had been left ajar. They took my statement but admitted there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. I stayed at a nearby hotel that night and caught the first flight home the next morning. Even now, I can't shake the memory of Jack's face or the way he smiled as he climbed through the balcony door. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I've never traveled alone since. I had been to this diner countless times, often alone, sometimes with friends. It wasn't anything special, just a small 24-hour spot with bad coffee, greasy food, and a few booths for the late-night crowd. But there was something about it that always kept me coming back, especially after a long day or when I just needed to clear my head. The familiar hum of the neon lights buzzed softly in the background as I walked through the door, a gentle warmth enveloping me. It was just past midnight, but the diner was quieter than usual. Only a few patrons sat at the counter, none of them paying much attention to each other. I didn't mind. I liked the solitude. Marissa, the waitress, greeted me with a tired smile. She had been working here for as long as I'd been coming, and there was always something genuine about her. She had a way of making you feel like you weren't just another customer, even though she had hundreds of them every week. But tonight, something felt different. She gave me my usual nod and walked over to my booth. But instead of her usual friendly demeanor, I noticed something was off. She didn't ask how I was or give her usual warm greeting. She seemed distracted, glancing over her shoulder as if she was waiting for something or someone. "Everything all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She hesitated, looking around before answering. "Yeah, just a little tired tonight," she said, but I could see her eyes darting to the kitchen door, then back to the patrons sitting at the counter. It wasn't like her to act so jumpy. I tried to brush it off, but my own unease began to grow. I ordered coffee and eggs over easy, and as she walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I had just started drinking my coffee when the door to the diner opened with a jingle, and a man stepped inside. I hadn't noticed him at first, but when I looked up, he was standing in the doorway. Tall, thin, unkempt hair, and a faded coat that seemed too big for him. Nothing too unusual about his appearance. But there was something in the way he looked at the room. He scanned it quickly, his eyes sweeping over the patrons before fixing on me. At first, I thought it was just coincidence, but when his eyes locked on mine, I felt a chill. There was something predatory in that gaze, something unsettling. I turned my attention back to my plate, trying to ignore him, but the feeling didn't go away. Marissa, who had been behind the counter, noticed the man too. I caught her glance toward him before she quickly hurried to the back. I was starting to feel the unease now, but I tried to push it aside. That's when I saw it. Marissa was standing in the back kitchen doorway, talking quickly to someone I couldn't see. Her voice hushed. She wasn't looking directly at the man, but her eyes were flicking toward him nervously. Her face was pale, her hand shaking slightly as she wiped down a counter. It wasn't like her at all. The man took a seat at a booth across from mine, and the moment he did, I noticed Marissa's discomfort had grown more pronounced. She kept glancing toward him, and I couldn't help but notice that her face had drained of color. I was still unsure what was going on, but I could tell that something wasn't right. When she returned with my eggs, I decided to ask her, as casually as I could, "Do you know that guy?" Her response was immediate, but it didn't sound convincing. "I've never seen him before." I glanced over at the man again. He was still there, staring at the menu, but I could feel his gaze on me, sharp and unnerving. Marissa seemed to be in a hurry as she started wiping down the counter again. "I need to check on something in the back," she said, her voice clipped. "I'll be right back." The man wasn't taking his eyes off me, though. I felt trapped. It wasn't just that he was staring, it was how intent his gaze was. He wasn't looking at me casually. Felt like he was studying me, deciding something. I didn't like it. But it wasn't until Marissa returned that I realized the true gravity of the situation. She walked to my booth, but her eyes didn't meet mine. Instead, she glanced quickly over her shoulder, back at the man. Then she stopped. "Is everything all right, Marissa?" I asked again, my voice a little sharper now, sensing that something was terribly wrong. She swallowed hard and hesitated before replying, "Yeah, I think I'll take my break. Just enjoy your meal." I looked over at the man again, but this time he wasn't staring. He was watching her. There was no mistaking it. He was waiting for her to leave. As soon as she stepped out of the booth, he stood up. Without a word, he walked toward the back, his eyes still fixed on me. A sudden, overwhelming sense of danger washed over me. I couldn't explain it, but it was the kind of feeling you get when your instincts scream that something's wrong. I wasn't about to stay in the diner much longer. I grabbed my coat, stood up, and walked toward the door. But then, just before I could push it open, I heard the man's voice. "You're not going to leave yet, are you?" I froze, my hand still on the door handle. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. I didn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was going on. But the more I thought about it, the worse it got. Marissa's strange behavior, the man's unsettling presence. Something was happening here, and I didn't want to find out what. I yanked the door open and ran into the night air. I didn't look back, even when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. I didn't care if I looked paranoid. The feeling that something terrible had been about to happen, something that I barely escaped, wouldn't leave me. And as I drove away from that diner, I couldn't shake the image of Marissa's pale face, her nerves, and that man's eyes fixed on me. There was more to this than I understood, and I didn't plan on finding out. I didn't return to that diner for a long time. After I ran out that night, leaving the evening behind, it was hard to forget the look on that man's face. His gaze still haunted me. I tried to convince myself it was just a random encounter with an unstable customer, but the unease wouldn't leave me. And then there was Marissa. I didn't know what had happened between her and that man, but I could tell she knew something important, something I didn't. I couldn't forget how she hurried into the back of the diner like she was trying to hide or escape. It was well past midnight when I decided to stop at a small diner just off the highway. I had been driving for hours, tired and starving, and I figured it would be a quick stop before I finished the long stretch of road to my destination. The diner, Jack's Grill, was a place I'd passed by dozens of times, but this was my first time actually stopping in. Inside, it was almost empty. Just a few scattered tables, a couple in the corner booth, and a man sitting alone at the counter. The place had an old-school feel. The vinyl booths, the jukebox in the corner playing a soft, steady hum, and the smell of grease in the air. I slid into a booth near the window and gave the menu a quick glance, knowing I didn't have much time before I needed to get back on the road. The waitress came over, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a worn smile. "What can I get you?" she asked. I ordered a cheeseburger and fries, and she nodded, disappearing into the kitchen. I noticed the man at the counter watching me, but I didn't think much of it. People are often lonely in diners like this, especially at odd hours. As I waited for my food, I glanced around. The couple in the booth didn't seem to notice me. They were too engrossed in their conversation. The man at the counter, though, kept looking at me. It wasn't a stare exactly, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. I looked away, trying to ignore it. Maybe he was just tired, like everyone else in the place. The waitress brought me my food, and I dug in, still trying to shake the weird vibe in the air. That's when the man at the counter stood up and approached me. He was older than me, maybe late 40s, wearing a leather jacket and scruffy jeans. He had the kind of look that made me think he hadn't really kept up with society, if you know what I mean. His face was rough, like he'd seen too much, and his eyes, they were cold. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice low but not unfriendly. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't in the mood for company, but I also didn't want to seem rude. "Sure, I guess," I said. He slid into the booth across from me, but instead of sitting back, he leaned in close. "You traveling through?" he asked, his eyes scanning my face as if he was looking for something. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep the conversation casual. "Just stopping for a break." "You've got that look about you," he said, his lips curling slightly. "The kind of look that says you've been driving too long." I nodded, feeling the sweat start to bead on the back of my neck. Something wasn't right, but I didn't know what. I tried to stay calm, hoping he was just a guy who liked to talk. "I've been here for a while," he continued. "Seen a lot of people come and go. You'd be surprised what you can pick up just by watching." I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but I wasn't interested in finding out. I finished my fries quickly, the food suddenly not so appetizing. "I should probably get going," I said, putting my napkin down. He didn't move. "Not so fast. You see, I'm real curious about people," he said. "Sometimes, I like to get a better look at them, see what makes them tick." My heart rate picked up. There was something in the way he said it, too casual, too knowing. I pushed my plate away and glanced around. The waitress was back in the kitchen, and the couple hadn't moved. It felt like I was alone in a room with a stranger who could do whatever he wanted. I stood up slowly, trying to keep my composure. "I really need to go," I said again, my voice firmer this time. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing for a split second before he smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "You don't have to leave yet," he said. "Not just yet." I didn't wait to hear anything else. I walked quickly to the door, but as I pushed it open, I heard him stand up behind me. I didn't look back, but I could feel his presence closing in. I could hear his boots hitting the floor with each step. I pushed the door open harder, nearly stumbling outside, and once I was on the sidewalk, I didn't stop to look back. I didn't even grab my keys from my pocket. I just ran to my car and jumped in, slamming the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The diner was still there, lights shining softly, but the man wasn't in the window anymore. I didn't know what would have happened if I had stayed, but I didn't want to find out. I never went back to that diner. Last night, I went to Elliot's Grill, a modest but popular restaurant that I'd been frequenting for years. It was one of those places that felt like home. Friendly staff, familiar faces, and reliable food. The evening started as any other. I was seated at a cozy booth near the back, close to the kitchen. The air smelled of sizzling steaks and warm bread. I placed my usual order, a medium-rare ribeye, and leaned back, scrolling on my phone while I waited. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of raised voices near the entrance. A man in his mid-30s was arguing with the hostess. He was tall and wiry, dressed in a rumpled hoodie and jeans, and had a wild, erratic energy about him. His voice was too loud, his gestures too aggressive. "I just need to talk to her," he barked, leaning over the hostess stand. "Sir, please lower your voice," the hostess replied firmly. "If you don't have a reservation, I'll have to ask you to leave." "I know she's here. Don't play games with me." The commotion drew the attention of everyone in the dining room. I shifted uncomfortably, hoping it would be resolved quickly. Eventually, the manager, a stout man with a no-nonsense demeanor, came out and escorted the man outside. The door closed, and the buzz of conversation slowly resumed. But I couldn't relax. Something about the man's desperation unsettled me. The ribeye arrived, cooked to perfection, but I barely touched it. My appetite was gone. I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see the man pacing outside. Halfway through my meal, the lights flickered. It was brief, just a second, but enough to make everyone pause. I looked toward the kitchen. The staff seemed on edge, whispering to each other as they worked. Then the door to the back alley burst open. It was the same man, his face twisted with anger. He held something in his hand, a crowbar. "Where is she?" he yelled, stepping into the dining room. Panic erupted. People screamed and ducked under tables. The manager tried to block the man's path, but he swung the crowbar wildly, forcing him to back off. "She's here. I know she's here," the man shouted, his eyes darting around the room. I froze, heart hammering. Who was he looking for? A waitress? Patron? Before anyone could stop him, he flipped over a table, sending plates and glasses crashing to the floor. The sound was deafening. "Call the police," someone yelled. I slid out of my booth and crouched behind it, clutching my phone. My fingers fumbled as I tried to dial 911. Suddenly, I heard heavy footsteps approaching. He was getting closer. "Don't hide from me," he bellowed. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't look behind the booth. Then I heard a voice, a woman's voice, trembling but firm. "I'm here. Just put the crowbar down." I peeked around the corner and saw a waitress standing near the bar. Her hands were raised, her face pale. "There you are," the man said, his tone softening slightly. "You thought you could just leave me, huh? Pretend I don't exist." "I didn't leave you," she said, her voice quivering. "But this isn't the place for this. Let's go outside and talk. Okay?" The man took a step toward her, lowering the crowbar slightly. For a moment, it seemed like she'd managed to calm him down. But then, someone moved, a patron trying to sneak toward the exit. The man whipped around, his rage flaring again. "Stay where you are," he roared, raising the crowbar. That's when the manager tackled him. The impact sent both men crashing to the floor. The crowbar clattered away, and a group of patrons quickly restrained the man until the police arrived. As they hauled him away, the waitress collapsed into a chair, sobbing. She later explained that the man was her ex-boyfriend, someone she'd left months ago after his behavior turned violent. She had changed her phone number, moved to a new apartment, and even started this new job to get away from him. I didn't finish my meal. As I walked out, I couldn't shake the image of the man's eyes, wild, unrelenting, and full of fury. It made me realize how thin the line is between a normal evening and something that could end in tragedy.